How's it going, guys? I am Folkman, your local brick build historian, with another episode of Brick Build History. Today we're taking a look at one of my personal favorite aircraft just because of the story behind it. This is the story of the Bell P-39 Airacobra, and it's introduced by Brickmania here, and without further ado, let's get into it. So of course, the first thing is to look at the box. P-39 Airacobra, World War II Allied fighter aircraft, 393 Lego and brick arm elements, one custom minifig, and you have a colored picture here of a three-quarter view of the aircraft. They have it in the American livery, as you can see, with the red circle star, the ever popular shark mouth, and everything over there. It looks to be a Bell licensed product, and it's original design by Brennan Putz. One of the two. I have number 3. It's 2309. The manufacturing plate, P-39 Airacobra, same stuff, skill level 3 out of 5. And then a side view of the aircraft. Move this to the side and let's take a look at the aircraft itself. So one of the things I really like about this model is the fact that it actually is sitting on its tricycle landing gear. And looking at some of the other tricycle landing gear aircraft, especially World War II aircraft, one of the things that they like to use, like the P-38 and the Messerschmitt Me-262, is having the weighted brick in the front. But as you can see, there's not any room for it. So the fact that he was able to get this aircraft to be able to lean itself forward without this weighted brick is actually quite impressive. Although if you do slightly touch it on the back, it will fall backwards, but you know, you shouldn't be doing that anyway often. Starting in the front, you have a big old propeller here, 3-bladed propeller, and you may notice this little thing sticking out the middle. We'll get to that eventually. You have the nose landing gear, which can turn, and you just flip this door down and you fold it in, and then the door can just go right back up and cover that. Going further down here, you have the 2 main landing gear. All they do is just fold in like that. Pretty easy, pretty simple, pretty slick. You have the machine guns here on the wing, and you may notice I have red stars on mine because I decided to go with the Soviet livery. Red stars on top as well. I should have dusted. These cool printed fuel caps here on the wing, and an interesting thing about the Airacobra is the fact that it has a door. Most aircraft usually has a canopy that opens off to the side or slides backwards. This, nope, car door. Why not? It also has a nice little aiming reticle for the pilot so that he can see what he's shooting at. You have the exhaust for the engine back here. A printed supercharger intake in the top here. The fuselage continues back here, sloping up, and then you have the vertical stabilizer and horizontal stabilizer. So all in all, a very, very simple aircraft, which I like. So, you know, I like simple. It's not really that expensive of a kit. All in all, I think it's a really good kit, and I really like having it. Also, it adds to my Soviet Air Force. But the history behind the P-39 was first developed in 1938. Well, its first flight was in 1938. It comes from a proposal called the Circular Proposal of X-TAC 609, which was introduced in 1935. And one of the things that was very important is that it's a single engine aircraft with high altitude interception and has to have 1,000 pounds of armament, which that is a huge task, and to this day probably the most demanding proposal for a fighter aircraft in American history. And today it doesn't seem like much, but back then, whenever it was all biplanes and they're just getting all metal aircraft figured out and all that, it's a pretty big deal. It would officially be introduced in 1941, originally as the P-45, and then after, or just before they started shipping these out, they changed its designation to the P-39. Why, I don't really know, but, aircraft designations are weird, especially in America. But so it would be given the designation P-39, and there are some that would go to England with a different nose cannon and different machine guns. But whenever they came back to us, it would be known as a P-400. So there's a lot of different designations that this thing has gone through, and it's barely even in service. So introduced in 1941, produced until 1944, whenever they started making the P-63, the Super Cobra. And basically it would fight until the end of the war. An interesting thing is that this was actually the first fighter, at least for America, with the tricycle landing gear, which is one gear in the front, two in the back, where it has this this standing up configuration. And then one exception being the P-38 having tricycle landing gear. All the other ones would have the tail dragger configuration. One of the initial design theories for this aircraft was to introduce turbo supercharging. Now, if you don't know what turbo supercharging is, you probably want to go watch a video on Greg's Airplanes and Automobiles, where he breaks down turbocharging to supercharging and the advantages of everything and all that. Because whenever he breaks it down, he makes it Barney style. But basically, this aircraft would have a turbocharger in the back, and turbocharging exhaust goes into the back, spins a turbine, and then the turbine forces air back into the engine for added boost. A supercharger uses a belt-driven system and intakes air through the inlet there, but it can only work in certain stages at certain speeds, and it's set to those. Well, whenever I had the turbocharger, it actually did do really good in high altitude, but there were still a few things that needed to be changed. So they go through some changes, and one of the biggest problems with this aircraft was drag. So they changed it to a supercharger. Biggest problem was when I went from a turbocharger to a supercharger, it was a single stage supercharger, meaning that it can only use one charger at one speed, and it can only work at certain altitudes. Most aircraft after this would have dual stage, main and auxiliary, and it could go even higher and higher, but putting the supercharger in this aircraft really limited it to low and medium altitudes. Now, you're probably wondering, why is the exhaust for the engine right here. Well, that's because the engine is behind the pilot. One of the interesting things that the Airacobra has is the fact that the engine is behind the pilot, and this is one of the few aircraft that would have this configuration. But I think besides its development ancestor or development predecessor, this is the only one that actually has the engine in the back with a tractor pull configuration, meaning that the propeller's in the front and the drive shaft goes through underneath the feet of the pilot over to the front. Now, a lot of people have very interesting theories as to why they did this, but it seems like the biggest reason was to allow for the cannon in the center. It's a 37 millimeter cannon that would shoot through the hub of the prop. Now, some of you might be thinking, well, why would they need to do that? Because the Germans were able to put a cannon through the hub of the prop of their aircraft, and their engines are right there. My biggest answer is, I don't know. Probably because those are 20 millimeter cannons and this is a 37 millimeter cannon. Although later on they would put 20 millimeter cannons, especially Hispano-Suizas, for the British. So I don't know. Aircraft manufacturers choose what they want. So the reputation of this aircraft is kind of weird. In America, we see it as basically a failure. Most American pilots don't like it. They never did like it, and they never will like it. It was pretty slow. It wasn't that maneuverable. The center of balance was weird, having this engine back here, so doing maneuvers with this aircraft were interesting, to say the least. The nose cannon was really a big topic of discussion, saying that it wasn't really that good. It was a slow rate of fire. It jammed a lot. Didn't really have much production for it, so they thought it was actually quite useless. And another thing is the lack of range. Really, the max range you can get from this going over and back is about 525 miles, which compared to a lot of other aircraft is quite abysmal, especially to the Zeros, which the American P-39s had to face a lot. So the severe lack of range really made this aircraft kind of looked down upon. And the British, whenever they got these aircraft and they found out that its high altitude use was basically nothing, and they were supposed to be used for high altitude, that's what the British were expecting. So what they did is kind of just put them on the wayside and didn't really use them. The Americans, they weren't really popular with the American USAAF. They tried making a naval version of it, but it really didn't go anywhere. Overall, it was looking like this aircraft was a complete failure until the Soviets. And a lot of people have this weird concept that the Soviets used this as a ground attack role. It's not exactly true. Even though the way that the Soviets say is kind of like ground personnel support for like the literal translation, it wasn't like CAS or close air support or like ground assault or anything like that. It was just supporting the armies on the ground through air-to-air fire. And these things would actually go toe-to-toe with a bunch of aircraft in the Eastern Front, including Focke-Wulf 190s, Bf-109s, Junkers 87s, Junkers 88s, Dornier Do-17s. Like, these things were actually used in combat against aircraft in the Eastern Front. and would actually prove to be very, very good. In fact, 5 of the 10 highest scoring aces in the USSR, a majority of their kills were in P-39s. And most people consider the P-39 as being as comparable or even better than most BF-109s in the Eastern Front, especially the E and F models. But as soon as the G models came out, it was probably, a little long in the tooth. And the Russians would actually modify these quite a bit. One of the first things they would do was take these wing-mounted machine guns off, which I probably should for optimal accuracy. Basically, they thought that taking off those machine guns would increase roll rate, which it does because you have less mass on the wings. They would remove armor. The P-39 was a very highly armored aircraft, especially for the day. And Soviets kind of felt that a lot of the armor was unnecessary. So they took off some of the armor, gave it better speed, more maneuverability because you have less weight of the aircraft, and some other modifications here and there. One of the biggest complaints they had was the nose-mounted cannon. They complained that the firing rate was too slow, 3 rounds per second, which is about 180 rounds per minute, which is very, very slow, and it only had 30 rounds. Also, they didn't have armor piercing, so it wasn't used for tank busting. It did some strafing, but so did every fighter aircraft of that time, so, there's a difference between it doing strafing and being a ground assault aircraft. So, this whole idea that the Soviets only use it for ground attack is a complete myth. Some of the specifications: it had an Allison V1710 TAC 85. It's a 1200 horsepower engine, which was pretty good, especially in the late 30s, early 40s. It's a V12 engine, so it has 12 cylinders in a V shape. We've talked about engines before. Max speed was 389 miles per hour, so it's almost right there at 400 miles per hour. But as soon as you remove some of the weight and get rid of some other stuff, it could probably reach that 400 in no time. The armament, it had one 37mm cannon in the center, sometimes replaced with a 20mm cannon. Would have 2 50 calibers in the wings, and then 2 50 calibers in the nose. Originally would have 2 30 calibers in the nose, but in the British version, it would have 2 303 caliber Brownings in the nose with a 20mm Hispano Suiza. So this thing had a lot of weapon configurations. One of the few bright sides of this aircraft was the fact that you could change the weapon configuration basically to what you need. But once again, the biggest downsides were the range. You couldn't exactly have fuel in the fuselage because you have the engine right here, the oil tank, or the oil tank back there. You have the radiator or the inlet for the supercharger right there. You have your whole gun system up here in the nose, so there's no place for fuel there. Plus you have the whole shaft for the propeller going through, so you really only have the wings, which really proved to be a downfall for it, but in the Eastern Front it doesn't really matter. The weird maneuverability, it's slow speed comparable to other aircraft at the time, and of course the single stage supercharger severely limiting its altitude. And I feel like if you would have put a dual stage in there, the altitude would go up, and it would probably be an even better fighter. But just like how they didn't update the Allison engines for the P-38, there was no use to updating the Allison engine in the P-39, especially since the P-63 was coming out, and you also had a bunch of other better choices, say the P-51. So, with all that said, this is really a fun aircraft for me, mostly because of the entire story behind it. I absolutely love the story of how it became a kind of a hated and no one wanted it aircraft in America to being absolutely loved in the Soviet Union, and is actually one of the, I think it's the single or the only American aircraft to have the highest amount of kills in a non-American Air Force or something. It's something like that. Like all the Lend-Lease aircraft we have given out, this is the one that has the most kills. So yeah, really show it to us. But with that said, if you like the video, thumbs up if you want, comment if you learn anything, or if you have any aircraft that you want me to review. I have a lot of aircraft to go through, so yeah, with that said, I've been Pokemon, and let's continue to build history.